Lee and Jackson had just won at the Battle of Chancellorsville in early May of '63. Jackson, of course, was mortally wounded in the aftermath of his climactic assault upon the Union flank. But this was, many people consider, Lee's greatest battle. But he wasn't absolutely satisfied with it. He certainly wasn't, because he hadn't done what he wanted to do, and that was destroy his enemy. He had let him get back across the Rappahannock River and regroup and recoup. He moved his army west to a place called Culpeper Courthouse and prepared to launch a drive through Maryland into southern Pennsylvania. At this moment, however, happenstance dictated that the Army of the Potomac would attempt a massive cavalry raid to A, find out what Lee was up to, where his army was, and B, try to destroy the cavalry of the Army of Northern Virginia led by J.E.B. Stuart. Those cavalry commands were roughly equal, about 10,000 on each side. Stuart was preparing to screen this march, that is to, in many ways, conduct Lee's army west of the Blue Ridge Mountains and down the Shenandoah Valley, across the Potomac River and into Maryland and then on into Pennsylvania. Stuart was set up to march, and what he got was a fight, because the Union cavalry, commanded by Alfred Pleasanton, crossed the Rappahannock at two different fords and really gave Stuart all that he could want in the way of a battle. Stuart was able to maintain his position at a place called Brandy Station. But Brandy Station on June 9th placed Stuart under a cloud. The Richmond papers really got on his case quite badly and accused him of spending too much time in the showboating and the pageantry of war and too little time getting ready to fight. So Stuart, on June 9th, 1863, suffered what was really a coming of age of the Northern cavalry. For the first time, they were able to fight essentially as equals. Part of the story of the battle is Stuart's zeal to ride around another Yankee army. He'd begun his ascent to fame by riding around George McClellan's army back in 1862 on the Virginia Peninsula. And in this case, he wanted to ride around Joseph Hooker's Army of the Potomac. And he did. He secured Lee's permission to do essentially what he thought best. And what he thought best was to get between Hooker and Washington as Hooker started north to encounter the Confederates who were already in Pennsylvania. In the process, though, Stuart was able to capture a major wagon train headed to supply Hooker's army. He attacked 200 wagons and captured 150 of them. But this, of course, slowed him down. And Stuart did something really rare for Stuart. He got lost. And he lost contact with two very, very large armies in a relatively small portion of south central Pennsylvania. And so he was very little help to Lee, and only contributed to the battle on the third day. Didn't arrive until the afternoon of the second day. Longstreet Lee called his old warhorse. And Longstreet was a capable lieutenant for Lee. Interestingly enough, the various times that he tries to be an independent commander sent on missions in which he is in charge, Longstreet doesn't perform quite so well. In this case, during the spring of 1863, Longstreet was down in southeastern Virginia near the town of Suffolk, attempting to lay siege to Suffolk and to confront an enemy presence in southeastern Virginia. But Longstreet keeps asking Lee, what should I do? in letters that sound almost plaintive after a while. Lee keeps responding, "Do what you think best, but do it decisively," which is Lee's leadership style. Lee suggests, he doesn't command very often. He wants to lead out of consensus. He wants people to recognize that he knows best and also recognize that he is the commanding general. And this works oftentimes. It certainly worked with Jackson. It usually worked with Longstreet. Longstreet was quite willing to play a supporting role. He was quite happy and gratified to have a voice that Lee heard and took notice of. Longstreet really didn't talk to Lee a great deal in person until the eve of the battle. He brought his army up from Suffolk through Richmond, had a conversation with Jefferson Davis in which he offered to lead an invasion of the Midwest, and that be the principal campaign in the early summer of '63. By this time, Davis had agreed to Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania, and so Longstreet was essentially patted on the head and told to go join Lee with his corps, and he did. Joe Hooker, who commanded the Army of the Potomac at the outset of the campaign, called himself Fighting Joe Hooker and was a fairly flamboyant, decisive, eager Union commander and had risen through the ranks of field-grade officers on the basis of his enthusiasm and his fighting spirit. At Chancellorsville, however, Hooker got first confused, then injured by a spent cannonball and knocked silly to the point at which he should have relinquished command but did not, and allowed his army to be pretty badly mauled before he recovered himself and led a retreat back over the Rappahannock River. Hooker was discredited, and when Lee began to push his columns through Maryland, across the Potomac, and into southern Pennsylvania, and indeed they got, some elements of Lee's army actually got just across the river from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the state capital. At this point, Lincoln lost patience with Hooker and realized the peril that his nation was in. And so the president replaced Hooker, and at this point replaced him with one of the few people that he could replace him with George G. Meade, who had been a corps commander. He was already with the Army, he knew the Army, but Meade only had less than a week before he would plunge that Army into a battle for its life. Meade had little more preparation than several days with which he used to acquaint himself with what the Army was like and then try to find Lee and find out what the campaign's going to be like. So Meade deserves an incredible amount of credit for bringing his army to the battle, getting it together, and fighting the battle that he did. Before Jackson died, Lee's army had essentially two wings of roughly 30,000+ each, commanded by Longstreet and Stonewall Jackson. After Jackson's death, Lee suggested that they divide the army into thirds, make each of these thirds commanded by a lieutenant general and be a corps of his army. And so this Trinitarian formula was Lee's answer of how to cope with the death of his most famous and renowned Lieutenant Jackson. He selected for command of these corps A.P. Hill, who had been a Sterling division commander who had saved the day for Lee's army at Sharpstown or Antietam when he had arrived in time, just in time, to hold Lee's right against McClellan's army. At this point, Hill is very raw and very new to commanding so many men. And so Lee tries to use Hill rather sparingly and does not depend on Hill for the kind of action that Hill provided at Sharpstown or Antietam. The other corps commander was Richard Stoddard Ewell, upon whom Lee did depend. His decision on the first day at Gettysburg to stop in the town and not take Cemetery Hill or part of the Cemetery Ridge, the commanding ground that overlooks the town of Gettysburg, essentially set the stage for the battle. It gave the North that decisive ground upon which to dig in and concentrate and all but dare the Confederates to come and attack them. And it all but dictated to Lee the necessity to attack if he wanted to try to have that decisive battle and have it here. Otherwise, he had to turn tail and go home. Gettysburg did not really happen because of a collection of shoes that were in the town. I mean, that was an incident that provoked a conflict between elements of the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac. What was important were the armies themselves. In order to win this war, one army had to destroy the other one. The goal of warfare is to destroy the enemy's will to resist, and obviously the best way to do that is to destroy the enemy's army. And that's why this war became what we can call total. That is, a war conducted not only against armies, but also civilians. In this case, Gettysburg happened because Lee wanted that climactic battle of annihilation, and Meade certainly needed to prevent it, and needed to be there in enough strength and resist the Confederate invasion. But in a larger sense, the war was gonna be over only when one side was thoroughly exhausted and absolutely defeated. I think Lee's perception of how to win the war and vision for victory developed over time during the war. He didn't come to command anything until June 1, 1862, when the war had been going on for over a year. Lee's frustration in that first year of the war, I think, convinced him that the Confederacy was a lot weaker than many people thought, and that Confederate resolve to maintain a separate identity was probably less than that Jefferson Davis perceived. And so Lee hatched his notion, which I think is quite natural and maybe even the most realistic, that the only way to win the war was to win it as soon as possible before Confederate armies get weaker and the Union armies get stronger, and to win it in one climactic battle of annihilation in which the Confederate army destroys the enemy and thus compels the enemy to do whatever the Confederates want, which is essentially to be left alone, to be an independent nation. Confederates cast themselves very much as the American revolutionaries had in 1776. They don't have to win the war. They have to keep from losing it. And the British, like the North, has the obligation to invade, to conquer. What Lee hopes to do is to do the same thing that George Washington had done at Yorktown, to defeat a major enemy army and thus compel the enemy to go away and leave them alone. Jefferson Davis, on the other hand, had come to his strategic vision, I think, over time in the way that Lee had, but certainly did not come to the same conclusions. Initially, Davis, responding to political pressure, wanted to defend every inch of Southern soil. And this, of course, fell into Union hands because the Confederacy did not have as many soldiers, nor as many resources, and couldn't defend every inch of Southern soil. Davis then came to a Napoleonic concept known as the offensive defense. That is, allow the enemy to penetrate, as the Confederates had been compelled to do so many times. But then, on ground of your choosing, at a time that pleases you, in circumstances that favor you, attack. attack those people who have attacked you and attempt to destroy their army. Lee's emphasis was on the offense, on the attack, on the destruction of an enemy army. Davis's emphasis was on the defense. Don't risk. Just hang on. Keep existing. The Confederacy becomes stronger every day it exists because it becomes more and more an accomplished fact. The Confederacy can win by not losing, the same as the American colonials had done in 1776. And that war had taken a long, long time. The ground around Gettysburg is important. If you go there, you see a very gradual slope in the ground that forms Cemetery Ridge. And indeed, Cemetery Hill is not any kind of major promontory. It's a worn down sort of rolling hill. And the same is true of Culp's Hill and the ridges that lead to Little Round Top and Big Round Top. The ground does change rather suddenly into Devil's Den, which is a mass of glacial tailings, the southernmost extremity of a major glacier that covered North America millions of years before. These rocks are huge boulders, and of course they provide a terrible place in which to fight, because you never know who's around the next rock, whether he be friend or foe. The first day's fighting was essentially about the town itself, and it featured Richard Ewell's command. And actually, Ewell and Hill arrived at Gettysburg coming from different directions, fortunately at roughly the same time. And so the leading elements of the Confederate Army came from two different directions and actually caught the Federals in a vice. They fought stubbornly, but it was rather clear that they were going to have to withdraw from the town, and they did. And then their question arose as to what to do next. Ewell decided to consolidate what he had and to remain in Gettysburg, the town, and not to pursue the fleeing Federals to the heights of Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge, and Culp's Hill, too. Ewell relied on Lee's admonition not to have a general battle before the entire army was up. That is, his army was concentrated. Ewell fell back upon this, even though one of his staff officers repeatedly offered to lead a charge on this high ground, and first asked for a division, then asked for a brigade, and finally agreed to do it with a regiment, which is roughly 1,000 men. By this time, most Confederate regiments were considerably less than 1,000 men, actually, perhaps a few hundred men. At any rate, Ewell determined to stay and consolidate what he already had. And so by the time Lee arrived and Longstreet's corps began arriving, the situation was that the United States had the heights around Gettysburg, and more troops were coming in. No one knew how many troops, because no one knew where Stuart was, and it was Stuart's job to find out where the Union Army was and in what strength. Civil War cavalries, unlike cavalry in earlier wars, were vital before a battle ever started, made considerably less contribution to the army once the battle had started than they did before the battle began, because their primary objective was to control that ground that lay between the two armies and find out what the enemy was doing and deny the enemy any information as to what the friendly forces were up to. Stuart had not provided this information this time, and so Lee never knew how many Federals were up there. He could tell, obviously from the fighting, that Meade was there in strength. He also knew that Meade was there and not Hooker, that Meade had replaced Hooker, and indeed responded when told of this, that General Meade will make no mistake, and if I make a mistake, he will be quick to take advantage of it, or words to that effect. Lee had respect for Meade because the two had known each other in the United States Army, as did many of the commanders in the Civil War. So the first day's fighting wound down with the Confederates holding the town of Gettysburg and beginning to array themselves around the high ground, and indeed did not know how far the Union formation went. Where is the Union battle line became the first question to ask. No one knew, in part because Stuart was a long way away at this time, and no one knew because they had just arrived on the scene. The second day's fighting became an attack on each flank of the Federal position. Lee wanted Ewell's corps to attack Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and to try to storm the Union right flank. Longstreet's corps was supposed to attack the Union left. Lee wanted Longstreet to concentrate on the Round Tops because if he could hold those, Confederate artillery up on those hills could then sweep down the ridgeline and make it untenable and force the United States to either attack or to retreat, and then Lee hoped to make something out of that maneuver, that is, to attack the enemy while he's moving. Always a good idea. Ewell, on the second day, did begin quite early in the morning. Indeed, earlier than Longstreet was even thinking about moving. And consequently, the two Confederate attacks were ill-coordinated. Ewell's was over before Longstreet's fairly began. Ewell was successful, some of his troops were, in taking some of Culp's Hill. And for a while, some troops commanded by Jubal Early actually held the crest. But they weren't there in enough strength, and reinforcements from the Union Army of the Potomac drove them off. Generally, historians have believed that Longstreet was entirely too slow and perhaps even criminally late in his attacks on the second day. Lee intended that Longstreet attack early, perhaps not at dawn, as some critics have claimed, but certainly as early in the morning as possible. Longstreet insisted after the fact that Lee never ordered him to do anything until 11 o'clock in the morning. Well, that may be true, because Lee encountered Longstreet at 11 once he realized that Longstreet had done nothing, had moved nowhere, and then directed him to make his attack. It took Longstreet a long, long time to get his corps into action. This was true because he took a circuitous route to get to what he thought might be the Union left flank. A scout sent up there by Lee earlier in the day had found the Round Tops empty. Actually, it's very difficult to imagine that this Confederate scout did find them empty, because in fact there were Union troops moving all around. It may have been that this Confederate simply didn't see. It may have been that the timing of his foray to the Round Tops coincided with the Union forces being out of sight and the roadways being obscured by trees or whatever. In any event, the impression prevailed that the Round Tops were entirely free of Union troops, and Longstreet went to great lengths to conceal his approach march, led by this, or guided, not led, and that's maybe a crucial factor, guided by the same man that Lee had sent up to scout the Round Tops. Longstreet did some backtracking and marched around in some circles in order to cover the fact that his corps was there. And so his attack never began until mid to late afternoon. The Confederate attack on the Union flank, left flank, led by Longstreet, accomplished considerable. It drove the Union forces out of the Peach Orchard into the Devil's Den, and indeed there was a crucial battle for Little Round Top. Had Longstreet been able to capture Little Round Top, as he tried, and presumably Big Round Top as well, the Confederates would have been able, with artillery, if nothing else, artillery and a strong infantry presence, been able to flank the Union line and force Meade to evacuate this very, very good ground around the town of Gettysburg. Lee would then have been able to attack Meade on the move and may have been able to have his battle of annihilation, his climactic battle, which he hoped would destroy the enemy army. The battle for the Round Tops, however, ended in the United States hanging on, perhaps by their fingernails in some cases. But they did hang on, and the Confederates were driven back in furious fighting that day. By the end of the day, Longstreet had suffered enormous casualties, and his troops had the satisfaction of having seen their objective and stood very near it, but then been driven off. Lee was ready to fight some more. Longstreet believed that what the Army should do now was probably what Longstreet thought the Army should have done the first day, and that was to sidestep to the right, in effect, to the northeast, and place itself between Meade's army and Washington. Thus, Longstreet believed that in a couple of days' maneuver, the Confederates could array themselves in an impregnable defensive position, force Meade to attack, and then batter him to pieces as they'd done Ambrose Burnside the previous winter, that is in December of '62, Fredericksburg. The region around Gettysburg had been pretty well swept clean, stripped bare by the Confederates in their foraging, that is, taking civilian food and giving Confederate money, which of course is not worth a great deal in Pennsylvania. So Lee had to be concerned about resupplying his army. And the only way to do that, Lee believed, was to fight the battle now, that is, precluding the need to resupply. And then you can have whatever you want, because the enemy will be no longer a factor. The only alternative to this, I guess, would have been to retreat back into Virginia. And this, for Lee, would have been the admission that, well, we came all the way up here to try to provoke this battle. We've tried to engage the enemy in a climactic struggle that will win or lose the war in one afternoon, or at least in a series of days. And when that moment came, we didn't like the odds, and we didn't like the ground, and so we turned tail and went home. This is not what Lee was there to do. He wanted to have this climactic battle, and he tried on the second day both flanks of Meade's army and found them pretty strong. He then determined that what he would try to do is break the very center of Meade's formation, to drive a wedge into the center of the defensive line on Cemetery Ridge. This would separate Meade's army into two halves, and then Lee could destroy those halves pretty well at his own leisure when he wanted to. Stuart showed up late in the afternoon on the second day, finally having ridden in from Carlisle. The march had been an admirable one. As soon as Stuart found out where the armies were and what was going on, he had led his army away from Carlisle beginning at 1 in the morning and ridden them hard to get them to the proximity of Gettysburg. When he arrived, Lee looked at him and reportedly said, "Well, General Stuart, I see you finally arrived." Coming from Lee, with his leadership style, this was equivalent to a chewing out, to a massive criticism on the part of Lee. Lee didn't want to talk to Stuart very much, although Stuart certainly wanted to talk to Lee. Stuart had tales of his adventures and was proud of his captured 150 wagons. Lee, of course, wanted to know about the enemy and what was happening on the other side of Cemetery Ridge.
On the eve of Gettysburg, George Pickett is very anxious to prove himself as a division commander. He's got an all-Virginia division. It's made up of 5 brigades, but 2 of the brigades are not with him on the march to Gettysburg. They've been left behind for various reasons, and he's feeling a little bit self-conscious about that. Again, he wants to prove himself. He's anxious for battle, but he feels that he's got a weak division, and he knows that he'll be expected to go into the fight as any other division. In early morning, July 2nd, say 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, a courier comes into camp, wakes up Pickett and says, "You've got to start marching." It's 25 miles from Chambersburg to Gettysburg. So that means the men march for 12 hours to arrive about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon on July 2nd. And Pickett immediately sends couriers to Longstreet and to Lee. And he says, as soon as, give my men an hour or 2 to rest and they're ready to go into battle. And Lee and Longstreet both say, "We'll need you tomorrow, but just let your men rest the night." So they arrive actually on the battlefield 9 o'clock, July 3rd. After the division had marched the 25 miles from Chambersburg to Gettysburg, the men were exhausted. It had been a very warm day, and one of the staff officers referred to the men as being jaded from the heat. But they seemed very excited about battle, about the prospect of battle, and several of Pickett's men in their diaries and letters talk about how excited they were and how confident they felt that once they entered battle, that they would prove themselves as a division. And so even that evening, there's a great anticipation as they wait. Some of the men are feeling relaxed enough to play and throw apples at each other. There's an apple orchard near where Pickett's men are resting, but there's real excitement. And everybody's very confident.
Lee determined to attack on that third day. He wanted Longstreet to attack early. Again, he wanted Longstreet's attack to coincide with Ewell's attack on the Union right, the Confederate left. Ewell's attack was to be a diversionary attack to keep Meade from reinforcing his center. And indeed, the first thing that Meade did on the third day of July, in anticipation of Lee renewing his attack, was to move some troops over onto his left flank where Longstreet had attacked before, believing that Lee would attack and would attack again on the flanks. So Meade, in some ways, cooperated with Lee by drawing troops from the center and strengthening his flanks instead of strengthening the center. Lee wanted Ewell's and Longstreet's attack to be very, very close to each other. Again, however, Longstreet was late and slow. He was so because a crucial division, Pickett's division, was new to this battle. Pickett's division had only just arrived in the vicinity.
Pickett's division does not make up the whole of the actual charge. There are 3 brigades, and there's really 11 brigades in total. But Pickett's division will make up they'll spearhead it. He'll direct the troops. And it includes North Carolinian men, the other brigades, and units from other divisions. Some of these men had fought the 2 days before and were exhausted.
Ewell attacked too early again. His attack did not coincide with Longstreet. And once again, his troops were able to force their way up the slopes of Culp's Hill, up the slopes of Cemetery Hill, without taking those positions. But this was not really Ewell's task. He was there primarily to occupy Union forces so they could not be available to resist the pressure which was supposed to hit their center.
The charge was going to begin after an artillery barrage on the Union lines, led by Longstreet's head of artillery, E.P. Alexander. About 159 guns were going to open up on the Union center and hopefully weaken the Union lines enough so the charge could succeed. And the artillery barrage begins about 1 o'clock, July 3rd.
It was a dramatic moment when practically every piece of artillery in Lee's army opened on the very center of Meade's line across Cemetery Ridge. Those who were there described it as a continuous sheet of noise. It was the largest artillery barrage that had occurred in the war to that time. Union guns answered from Little Round Top and from Cemetery Ridge.
By 1:30, an exchange of correspondence occurs between Longstreet and Alexander, which is kind of interesting. Longstreet did not feel confident at all about Gettysburg. He had been dragging his feet through the entire battle, and he felt this charge was doomed. And he had already expressed his concerns to Lee, and Lee refused to change. So Longstreet and Pickett was a very close friend of Longstreet's. They had served together in the Mexican War, and they almost had it like a father and son relationship. Longstreet seemed to take special time out to make sure Pickett understood things, just seemed to have a special bond with Pickett. And so he was very much worried and just felt that this was going to fail. So he tells Alexander that only if he sees a weakening in the Union line should Alexander signal the charge to begin. And Alexander writes back, or sends a courier back to Longstreet, and says essentially, if there's any chance that if there's any other plan, let's not do this, because Alexander too sees this as somewhat futile. The men were going to charge across about just under a mile, and it was open field, and everyone knew that there would be huge casualties. So Longstreet sends back another courier and says, "There's no other plan. This has got to happen, and as soon as you see a moment, any sign of weakness, we'll get Pickett ready and start the charge."
The Confederate barrage tended to operate on a fixed firing pattern. That is, the guns aimed at the ridge and retained that aim and never shifted their fire in the course of about an hour's barrage. Hence, they raked the backside and top of the ridgeline, creating havoc in the Federal rear without damaging all that much the Federal infantry who were stationed in rifle pits on the front side of the ridge. This became crucial later on. It did, this barrage, isolate the Confederate troops on Cemetery Ridge and did not allow Meade to resupply or reinforce them, because anyone who tried to would have to face a field of exploding shells the Confederates were lobbing in their direction. The Union artillery stopped firing and withdrew some of its guns from the firing line, giving the impression that the Confederate barrage had been very effective in silencing the Union guns. In point of fact, however, these guns were simply being taken away so that others could be brought in, or taken away so they could come back with full ammunition chests. The Confederate commander, who in effect was in charge of this barrage, Edward Porter Alexander, realized and could see in his glasses that Union artillery was not being disabled, but that the Union soldiers were hitching up the horses to the guns and drawing them away. And he knew this tactic. It was one of his own. It was a known gimmick in the way of fighting artillery. You take the guns away, the enemy believes they're not there, you bring them back and open fire again when the enemy has committed himself. Alexander, however, believed that if Pickett were to act now, were to move and this charge get underway, that the Confederates would catch the Federal artillery in the process of refilling their ammunition chests or replacing their guns, and that Federal artillery would not be effective in resisting the charge, that the day would be ours, was Alexander's memory of his thoughts. If Pickett will move, and hence he sent him a couple of hurry-up messages, come quick, or I can't support you. In fact, Alexander was running out of ammunition.
support, but that infantry support would come in as soon as it was needed. So he just had no idea that his division, and the other men included, would just go onto this open field and really be left to slaughter, which is what happens.
The Confederate ranks were shot to pieces on the way. Nevertheless, the Confederates were able to take the stone wall that marked the center of the Union battle line and drive the Federals away from it. They drove them, however, back into the arms of other Federals who were there to reinforce. And the reinforcements were able to do the work. They surrounded the Confederate penetration on three sides and made relatively short work of those Confederates who got inside the Union battle line.
The casualties are huge. Nearly half of Pickett's division is lost, is wounded or killed. Something like 32 out of 33 of his field officers wounded or killed. 9 of his generals are down. And it's interesting because if Pickett had led the charge, there's little doubt that he would have been killed or wounded, which maybe would have helped his career or his reputation. But he watches the fiasco that occurs, the defeat, in utter disbelief. As I said, he really thought that surely his men would move forward, but then there would be reinforcements. And this doesn't happen. On the left, some artillery support he counted on had run out of artillery. There was none left after the artillery barrage before the charge. On the other side, on the right, the unit that had been called in to help him lost its way and ended up being shot on from both sides. And Longstreet, as I said, he seemed already convinced himself that it was going to fail, and he seemed to hesitate about sending reinforcements. He finally did, but as I said, it was really too late, and the unit that went didn't do any help. And in those final moments, there are numerous accounts of Pickett crying, of him just being despondent. One artillery officer tells him, riding toward Pickett and asking him, "General, what should I do? I'm waiting, I'm ready, I do have some guns ready for your support, but I don't like the looks of things." And Pickett doesn't even answer him, doesn't look at him, just looks straight ahead and says, "Save your guns, it's over."
I think it's instructive that some observers who watched from the Confederate side paid attention to Lee and noticed that he didn't receive that whole afternoon but about 2 messages. Whereas if you look at the official records of Union Confederate armies, Meade headquarters was buzzing with messages, all coming and going, and Meade was trying to maintain some control of the battle from his headquarters. To the contrary, Lee simply stood on a piece of high ground on Seminary Ridge, watched as much as he could see, and didn't really talk to anyone.
Longstreet evidently sees Pickett, tries to comfort him, tells him it's not quite as bad as it seems, and Pickett just destroyed. As I said, he's crying and repeating over and over again, "My division, my division."
In the wake of Pickett's charge, Lee actually rode out among the survivors, the men who were stumbling back, many of them wounded, all of them scared, and proclaimed, "It's all my fault." Told Pickett himself that his men had performed splendidly and that the fault for their defeat lay with Lee and not with anyone else, and that it would all come right. Lee expected Meade to counterattack, although Meade did not, but he ordered Pickett to rally his men, to try to get them together, form a defensive line, be ready to repel a Federal attack in the wake of the failure of Pickett's charge.
Meade knew, he had a guess that Lee was going to strike at the center. Lee had already tried both flanks of the Union line, the left and the right. And as a matter of fact, the morning of July 3rd, Lee tried again near Culp's Hill, and that failed. So Meade knew that something was going to happen, and he had his men bracing for an attack. And indeed, when the charge began, the men were ready, although they were surprised to see this mile long of men lined up in the open, and it didn't take long for them to get easy sights of the Union artillery, and they could just mow down ranks and be perfectly safe from where they were. Even the Confederate artillery barrage had done very little damage to the Union line, despite Alexander's thoughts or his guess that maybe some of the guns had been pulled out, and he first directs Pickett to move forward. This wasn't really happening. None of the guns were being moved out, they were just kind of being shifted. The Union was very much ready for the attack.
In the wake of the battle, Lee determined that he had to withdraw, that the day was not his, and he would have to take his army back into Virginia. He did so probably for the same reason that he had resisted Longstreet's counsel to stand on the defensive and to simply shift his army and await Meade's attack. He had run out of food, and he didn't know where to get any more. His supply lines really didn't exist because he had no supply line with any base in the South. So he had to retreat back into Virginia, and he only hoped that Meade had been battered enough by the battle that he wouldn't be able to organize an effective pursuit. So Lee simply sat in front of Meade for a day, in effect daring the enemy to attack, while he tried to organize a retreat. He wanted this retreat, of course, to be orderly and not lead to the annihilation of his army. It rained an incredible amount, off and on the 4th of July, 1864. It was as though nature was trying somehow to absolve these men of the heinous crimes they had committed by killing each other, wounding each other, maiming each other. Very, very late at night, in the aftermath of Pickett's charge and the climactic third day at Gettysburg, Lee called to his headquarters John D. Imboden, who was a cavalry commander. He wanted Imboden to lead the wagon train of supplies and wounded men. Actually, most of these wagons were empty of supplies. They were filled with wounded, however. Lead the wagon train back south, back into Virginia, over another road system than the one in which he intended to take his army. So Imboden arrived at Lee's headquarters late. Lee arrived even later still, perhaps at 1 o'clock in the morning. And Imboden described in his memoirs what it was like to encounter this beaten general who had been already hard at work for hours trying to organize not victory, but some way to stave off greater defeat, and in this case, a retreat. Imboden wrote down, after perhaps a minute or two, he suddenly straightened up to his full height, turning to me with more animation and excitement of manner than I had ever seen in him before. He said in a voice tremulous with emotion, "I never saw troops behave more magnificently than Pickett's division of Virginians did today in that grand charge upon the enemy. And if they had been supported as they were to have been, we should have held the position and the day would have been ours." This was Lee's analysis of what had happened at Pickett's charge. They had broken through the enemy line, but they hadn't been supported. Were they to have been, is the question. Obviously, Lee thought so. By whom must be the next question. And the answer has to be Longstreet.
When it comes time for him to write the report of the battle, evidently Pickett lets out a tirade of accusations, criticisms, names, in saying that his division, his proud division, had been criminally maligned, that somehow the Confederate command had brought this on, when of course it was a number of factors that led to its failure, but Pickett couldn't separate himself personally from the failure of the charge. And Lee, when he receives this report, feels that he just cannot have this officially let in the open. It would just pour salt, so to speak, on the wounds of this army that's trying to return to Virginia and regroup. And he says to Pickett to destroy it and to write a new one. And Pickett refuses. There's rumors and stories that Pickett's report is kept in some trunk, that his wife kept it, but it's never surfaced.
Longstreet, in a series of memoirs, became stronger and stronger in his insistence that he had offered an alternative plan, that of shifting the army to the right and blocking Meade from Washington. He also became stronger and stronger in his insistence that he was not at fault for anything that had happened that third day. He distanced himself from the control of Pickett's charge more and more every time he wrote the story down. He insisted that he did not involve the other divisions which he commanded, in this case the divisions of Hood and McLaws, because they were necessary to defend the Confederate right against those Federals who still were on the Round Tops, Big Round Top and Little Round Top. The impression he leaves, from his memoirs at least, is that had he committed these people, that is, more people to Pickett's charge, to a supporting element, as Lee seems to indicate he expected. If he had committed more people, that the Federals would have stormed down from the Round Tops and would have crushed the Confederate right. What this says to me is that Longstreet must have had the authority, and it was certainly Lee's leadership style to give that authority, to involve whomever he wanted in Pickett's charge. And so the decision to limit the charge to 12 to 15,000, which is an enormous number of men, but to limit it to that and not to send in massive supporting columns, must have been Longstreet's.
The failure of the charge had little to do with George Pickett. It wasn't his plan. He didn't do more than align his brigades and give them the orders to march. He did direct things from behind the lines, but really Longstreet and Lee were the ones that should get more of the responsibility, and Lee did accept and did admit to the failure of the charge, but it didn't matter much to Pickett. And there's some people that wonder if Pickett had the support that he had counted on, if he had the infantry support, the artillery support, would he have succeeded? Would the charge have succeeded? And it seems like maybe the charge would have succeeded. Maybe he would have gotten to Cemetery Ridge and broken some of the line, but what would have happened after that doesn't seem that it would have been so decisive, because there were plenty of Union forces to join in the fight, and even if they had succeeded and July 3rd ended with a Confederate victory, you have to go back and wonder, well, you had Fredericksburg and you had Chancellorsville, and the war continued. What would have happened? Would it have ended the war? Would Meade's army be destroyed? You start getting into these areas that it's hard to say that it would have had that much effect, but people like to say it was the high water mark, that after that the Confederacy never could hope to win.
Gettysburg was a terrible blow to the Confederacy. As long as 2 weeks after the battle, some newspapers were still proclaiming a victory in the South. Yet, in time, the reality set in, and people realized that Lee had gone there and had tried to fight a major battle and had lost that major battle. This combined with the fall of Vicksburg, which occurred on July 4th, 1863, really sent the Confederacy reeling. In 2 days, the Confederacy had lost 50,000 men and perhaps 85,000 stand of arms. The wonder is that the Confederacy could even operate in August of 1863. A Charleston newspaper, the Mercury, even accused Lee of being an incompetent general for fighting at Gettysburg and for conducting that campaign, which the newspaper editor termed imbecilic, I think was his word.
Five years after the war, John Mosby, who was a Confederate cavalry commander, very successful cavalry commander, tells of running into George Pickett in Richmond. Mosby had just seen General Lee, Robert E. Lee, in a hotel, had a short meeting with him, and he tells Pickett this, for lack of anything else to say. And Pickett immediately seems interested in wanting to see Lee, and he says to Mosby, "Will you come with me to see the general?" And Mosby's surprised at this request because he knows that Pickett had been one of Lee's generals, and he doesn't understand why there'd be any need for an introduction, but he agrees. And according to Mosby, the interview that follows was cold and formal, and there's a lot of silence in the room, and Mosby felt extremely uncomfortable, and it lasts just a few moments. And as they're walking out of the hotel, Pickett, kind of under his breath, says, "That old man destroyed my division." And Mosby turns to him and said, "Well, it made you immortal."
Gettysburg was an enormous defeat. It affected the morale of Southerners, no matter where they were, and it certainly affected the morale in Lee's army. So much so that in the wake of Gettysburg in mid-August, Lee actually offered to resign, submitted his resignation to Jefferson Davis. The criticism that he had heard indirectly, but that no one had presented to him directly, criticism of his handling of the battle, of his generalship, of the way the army had been led. One of Lee's staff officers points out that there were 9 brigades involved in this attack, while 22 more brigades stood around and watched. What, he suggested, would have happened had Lee involved, or somebody involved, more than 9 brigades in the assault, and made it more massive than it was, risked even more and this certainly would be consistent with Lee's strategic thinking, that is, to risk all when the goal is potential victory. What if the Confederates had risked more? Well, I, for one, think, and think is all I can say, I don't know, think that Pickett's charge had a chance of succeeding. After all, they did take that first Union line across that stone wall at the Bloody Angle. What if more brigades of fresh troops had stormed in after them and held that gap open? Then Meade's army would have been split in half, and Lee could possibly, potentially, have destroyed Meade's fractions with his own mass, his whole army, against fractions of Meade's. It failed, but of course it was Lee's fault. I think it's consistent with Lee's vision of victory and the tactical control of the battle and the way it happened seems to suggest that Lee had a better plan than what happened, and that perhaps Lee lost the battle for precisely the reason that he won lots of other battles, because he was willing to risk and because he gave his subordinates the authority and gave them the freedom to do what they thought best in the circumstance, to come up fast and start fighting, which was, of course, Lee's inclination. Jackson did it, and Jackson was as close as predictable to coming up fast and fighting as Jackson could be predictable. With other subordinates, however, Lee was less successful. Certainly Longstreet was successful on other occasions. Certainly Stuart was. Certainly Hill was. Certainly Ewell was. And all the other people whose actions seem to have contributed, been part of that fabric of Confederate defeat. But they were unsuccessful in this case for the very reason that they were successful at other times. Because Lee's whole style of leadership was to select the best possible subordinates, give them the most freedom possible, bring them to the right place at the right time, and simply hope that they would do the right thing. And this, I think, is really what Gettysburg was about, and what Lee's defeat was about. I think one of Lee's great virtues was his capacity to cope with frustration, with adversity, and with defeat. And in the wake of Gettysburg, he certainly kept his army together. He even infused greater morale among the men when he stood and, in effect, dared Meade to come and attack him. He would fight great battles later in his career as Confederate commander and commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. He was able to pull his army together, take it back into Virginia, and make it again, eventually, that formidable force that it had been before. But Lee's analysis of the war, I think, proved correct. That is, his army was going to get progressively weaker while the enemy would get progressively stronger in numbers of troops and in the capacity to supply those troops.
Pickett's next chance to make up for the fiasco at Gettysburg, to prove himself again as a commander, comes in February 1864 when he's heading up the Department of North Carolina. And what's significant about this is he fails in another military expedition. He's supposed to retake the city of New Bern, and he fails. But he ends up capturing some North Carolinian men that had joined the Home Guard in North Carolina and switched to the Union when conscription came. The Confederacy enacted conscription. And he captures these men and he sets up a court-martial and quickly moves to have them hanged, about 20 men. He actually brings them to the town where a lot of them are from, has them hanged in front of their wives. It's a very dramatic and intense episode of the Civil War in general, so much so that later Pickett is almost tried for war crimes. An actual court of inquiry is set up, and a judge wants Pickett arrested. Pickett runs to Canada and lives there. It's unclear how long, but for at least a year, living under an assumed name, cuts his hair that had been his pride. His wife works teaching piano, and he's so ill physically that he spends days bedridden. After this happens, this whole fiasco in North Carolina, he wants very badly to have his division back. And up to that point, the remainder of his division had just been broken up. And he gets it back in the summer of 1864. He rejoins Longstreet and rejoins the Army of Northern Virginia and Lee. And I'm sure he felt that maybe it was a second chance. But the summer of 1864 brings the Siege of Petersburg, and the war is winding down. And at the Battle of Five Forks, he again fails, so much so that Lee removes him from command, and that's the final chapter as far as the Civil War for George Pickett.
Davis settled down for the long war. He had to believe that this long war was what would happen, and he had to be ready for it. If it didn't happen, well, that's so much the better. But he was ready to fight as long as the United States had the will to come down and try to conquer the Confederacy. He miscalculated very gravely the will of the United States. And probably the reason the United States won the Civil War was that Americans were enthusiastic enough and were strong enough in their conviction that the Union had to be maintained. The Union as a vehicle for maintaining a mission for this country, for continuing humanitarian reform, that is the abolition of slavery, and to encourage the growth of industrial capitalism to power and progress.